Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, February 2nd, 2022, and on this episode, I'm talking about how fear, how paranoia, being frightened of all kinds of stuff, drives the size, scope, and power of government. It always has and always will. I'm going to highlight a fable of sorts from a recent article by John Whitehead over at the Rutherford Institute. I'm going to bounce back and forth between issues he raises and some warnings from the founding generation. I think it should make for a fun little ride, but I appreciate you being here, and I'll get to that in just a moment. First of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow us. It's got all the archives of the show on individual episodes, which I publish generally a blog post generally about an hour to 2 hours after the live stream is done. You can find links and references to stuff that I talk about so you can read and learn more. Today, you're going to find John Whitehead's article, plus you're going to find a lot of original source documents from the founders for the quotes that I'm mentioning that fit, I think, pretty well on this and for all time. You can find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones, YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Twitch. We also live stream on what I think is the most important video platform out there, the decentralized, censorship-resistant Odyssey.com. Please follow us there. We also upload the archive version all over the place from Gab and BitChute and Brighteon and BitTube and Rumble, everywhere we can think of, Minds. And we have the audio-only podcast edition all over the place. I appreciate the reviews that have been coming in on Apple and Podbean and elsewhere. Of course, you can find our membership program there as well, where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. And while I allow people another minute or two to get notifications from those mainstream platforms, which are often slow, I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. Looks like there's some good back and forth going. Alan Mosley is in here, so that means it's always going to be fun. Richard Banks in Kansas, Cheriton Farmer in Missouri, Eris Legacy, Israel in Colorado, Dixie Strong in Alabama, Guneye also in Missouri, Clay Kent, Sharon Patriot here in SoCal, Robert Sanderson. Man, Missouri is really represented. I appreciate you guys. A lot of work to do everywhere, but we've seen some great grassroots efforts, especially to support the right to keep and bear arms in Missouri. There's still a fight going on there. Blue North Wind, Ryan Korn, Angel Eyes Over Texas, Larry Clark, Robert Eli in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And Helen Mosley says, what a perfect topic for Robert Higgs's recent birthday, without a doubt. Erwin Havernick says, fear is the playbook. And fear drives people to just voluntarily, go into submission, get on their knees and beg for help from government. And it's pretty scary. Huh, that's a pun. I think. Not that one. Not that one was intended. Leslie G. and everyone else, Blue North Wind, I appreciate you guys being here. And let's get right to it. I want to start out with John Whitehead's introduction in his article. It says, Totalitarian Paranoia Run Amok. This is over at the Rutherford Institute. We republish many of his articles on a week-to-week basis. Here's how he put it. Once upon a time, there was a government so paranoid about its hold on power. If you think about it, the fear goes both directions. People with power, of course, people who want to exercise power and people who want to control other people, they're living in fear as well because they recognize that what they're doing is monstrous and evil and that people are going to get pissed off eventually. And we know what happens when that happens. So there is a government so paranoid about its hold on power, he writes, that it treated everyone and everything as a threat and a reason to expand its powers. Unfortunately, the citizens of this nation believed everything they were told by their government, and they suffered for it. And of course, I'm wearing the t-shirt today. This is a quote that I've cited many, many times from John Adams back when he was one of the good guys, the Atlas of Independence leading up to the Declaration. This was from April of 1776. He wrote that fear is the foundation of most governments. I should make a version of the t-shirt where I actually cross off, put a line through the word most, because that's the only error there. Fear is the foundation of government power. Now, Adams had this faith, and you see this a lot of times on the Federalist side. A lot of times, and I'll be getting to this in my series on Cato's anti-Federalist papers, a lot of times the Federalists really felt that the people themselves were so virtuous, and I think they were thinking short-term, that they wouldn't tolerate this kind of thing. And that's how Adams continued it. And I think that was his error, as well as many others from that generation. Fear is the foundation of most governments, he continues, but is so sordid and brutal a passion, and renders men in whose breasts it predominates so stupid and miserable. So, quick aside, fear drives government. It makes people dumb and miserable, makes them make stupid choices because they're afraid, and they won't think about the ramifications of their choices and what they're asking for. And therefore, that's what John Adams, if it walks like a duck, I guess he calls it out. So stupid and miserable. He said that Americans will not be likely to approve of any political institution which is founded on it. And maybe at that time, but it sure changed pretty quickly. Back to John Whitehead again. He says, and this is back, it's kind of a fable, but it also is very realistic. When terrorists attacked the country and the government passed massive laws aimed at paving the way for a surveillance state, the people believed it was done merely to keep them safe, right? How many times have we heard that? This is for your security. This is for national security. Everything is national security. Regulation of crypto now is going to be for national security. Always national security. And we all know that famous Benjamin Franklin quote. There's variations of it. I think this might be the original version from the 1750s. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. They're not worth either. They don't deserve any of it. Back to John Whitehead, he said, when the government waged costly, preemptive wars on foreign countries, insisting it was necessary to protect the nation, the citizens believed it. They just keep believing what they're told because they're scared. Or they're just so scared that they're like, someone's got to do something, and this government is going to do the right job, although it never does. And when the government brought the weapons and tactics of war home to use against the populace, claiming it was just a way to recycle old equipment, the people believed that too. The few who disagreed were labeled unpatriotic. Have you ever been told that you're with the terrorists for opposing foreign wars, or that you hate America if you don't want local police to be fed military gear that was used in a siege in Fallujah? And a lot of times, I think it's somewhere between 30 and 40% was never just recycling. A lot of times, that's the message. They're just recycling old equipment. They have to be able to use this. But a lot of the equipment that the federal government unconstitutionally is handing out to control and manipulate local police offices, police departments, is actually brand new stuff. Now that, of course, reminds me of John Dickinson in his famous Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, which earned him the name the penman of the Revolution in 1767 and 1768. And he understood the money said to be taken from us for our defense may be employed to our injury. And if you think about what John was writing about, he said, you have all these preemptive wars. People just go for that. Then, of course, you have all this warfare equipment. A lot of times you bring some of the soldiers back home. You bring the equipment back home. You provide this entire structure, and you create a militarized police as well. And they're using that to our injury, just like John Dickinson warned. Back to John Whitehead. Then you have the government's Machiavellian schemes for unleashing all manner of dangers on an unsuspecting populace, then demanding additional powers in order to protect we the people from the threats. Most of the problems that we face were caused by government. And going to the government to fix problems that were created by the government in the first place is a really stupid strategy. Getting back to what John Adams had to say, this fear of all these problems, of all these things, rather than trying to solve them in the marketplace, in the community, in society, it's looking for control. Almost every national security threat, John writes, that the government has claimed greater powers in order to fight, all while undermining the liberties of the American citizenry, has been manufactured in one way or another by the government. And I wanted to highlight, this is actually later in the article, I wanted to put this right near the top, Because we've been told in the past, hey, sometimes this guy, when you run his stuff, it's a little kooky, it's a little tinfoil hatty. Maybe it isn't as serious as the work that you guys do at 10th Amendment Center. And, the idea that government is doing a bad job is one thing, but that government is creating the problem, that's nuts. But James Madison himself was a tinfoil hat-wearing person. In the run-up to the signing of the Alien and Sedition Acts, those hated unconstitutional acts of 1798, signed by John Adams when he flipped the switch to being one of the bad guys, here's Madison writing to Thomas Jefferson. I think it was May 13th-ish, 1798. And he said, perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged to provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad. Now, I think that those words just speak for themselves. If it's bad to say that maybe government would actually charge things, danger, tell us that there's dangers from abroad and fake it. If that's a bad thing, then James Madison, father of the Constitution, was a lying tinfoil hat crackpot. And I think that's very important to remember that even back in 1798, he was recognizing that this is what government would do. It has always done it. So we shouldn't be surprised when the largest government in the history of the world, the one that we live under today, would do the same thing. This isn't stupid. This isn't foolish. This isn't deluded to think that. It's actually realistic. It's smart to approach things and recognize what has happened all through history. Back to John Whitehead, he said, by the time the government began using nationalized police and the military to routinely lock down the nation, the citizenry had become so acclimated to such states of emergency that they barely even noticed the prison walls that had grown up around them. And I know a lot of times people are like, this president, this administration is so awful. And this administration is so awful. Maybe the worst in history is always the current one. But those powers that they're exercising today, state, local, federal level, they didn't just come out of nowhere. It's not like they didn't exist 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Every single successive administration expands power, expands the size and scope of government. When you hit 30 trillion in debt, maybe the previous one was under 28 and the other one was 22 and the other one was 20. They're all bad. They just keep growing it. And the worst one always seems to be the current one. But if we ignore what has led to where we are, then we're basically ignoring the solution to the problem. John continues. He says, after all, like the proverbial boiling frogs, the government has been gradually acclimating us to the specter of a police state for years now. You don't scare them, he writes, by making dramatic changes. Rather, you acclimate them slowly to their prison walls. And this is another one from James Madison. I think this was in the Virginia Ratifying Convention where he was debating with Patrick Henry in the summer of 1788. And here's how Madison put it. There are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations. So they're always expanding their power. They're always building the foundation for more and more and more. And then when there's some kind of event that they can take advantage of or create or scare people with, it's going to seem like all of a sudden there's tons of new power. Going back to John, he says, persuade the citizenry that their prison walls are merely intended to keep them safe and the danger out. That's what they always do. Desensitize them to violence. Acclimate them to a military presence in their communities. And persuade them that only a militarized government can alter the seemingly hopeless trajectory of the nation. And that brings me to Thomas Paine, who wrote, as a pretense for a large standing army. Remember, large standing armies were considered the bane of liberty at the time of the founding generation. Their experience in 1763 and 1770 certainly reinforced that, but they understood this principle from their tradition of things that they learned about all through life. So as a pretense for a large standing army, Thomas Paine wrote, the danger of a foreign invasion must be bellowed forth from the pulpit, from the press, and by their public orators. And Paine recognized, like so many others, that it wasn't just the government who was going to push this propaganda. There are many others in the pulpit, the press, and public orators. So people supporting the size and scope of the monster state. John Whitehead points out that now every fable has a moral. Every fable has a moral. And the moral of this story is to beware of anyone who urges you to ignore your better instincts and blindly trust that the government has your best interests at heart. I chuckle a little bit when I say that, but it's so true. I mean, and it depends on who's in power. You see, tens of millions of people will believe, based on who's in power, that government has their best interests at heart. I know there's a lot of opposition on the right to the current government, but just 2 years ago, anytime anybody talked about the size and scope of federal power, a lot of those same people would defend anything and everything that they did because they liked the dude who was there. And so now, rather than recognizing that government, the structure itself is the problem, we don't just have a personnel problem. Now it's even worse. And as long as that continues, this faction type approach, this partisan hack approach, I think it will continue to get much, much worse. I don't think we're anywhere close to turning this around. And as I mentioned on Monday's show, the first of a series on the anti-federalist writings of Cato. Cato #1 was the first anti-federalist paper that was published September of 1787. Here's how he put it right near the end. Attach yourselves to measures, not to men. That's principle over party, principle over personality, anti-federalist style. Another one is Patrick Henry in this debate with James Madison in June of 1788, Virginia Ratifying Convention. Show me that age and country where the rights and liberties of the people were placed on the sole chance of their rulers being good men without a consequent loss of liberty. He recognized that that was a mad attempt. That's how he followed it up. Relying on your government people to do the right thing, especially in times of fear, especially in times of emergency or what may seem like danger, real or pretended, as James Madison put it, that's when government is going to be the greatest threat. And to close it out here, again, from John over at the Rutherford Institute, he said, most critically of all, this has been a test. And I think that's actually very true. It's been a long-term test to see whether the Constitution and our commitment to the principles enshrined in the Bill of Rights could survive a national crisis and true state of emergency. And I think the real state of emergency is the fact that we live under a government that tries to control us in every aspect of our lives, whether or not we can defend our homes and our family and how. What size toilet we're going to have. Literally, they have national one-size-fits-all guidelines, requirements, regulations on the size of your toilet. Okay, if you guys want to come and check out to make sure mine's the right size while I'm using, you're welcome to. They tell us what kind of plants we can grow and consume in our own home, whether or not we buy or sell them. If you think of the grand scope of their power, it is absurd, and that is a state of emergency. It's a state of emergency that they're destroying the value of the dollar every single day, and they just keep spending more and more and more. It's never, ever enough for these people. Anyways, he says, could this, I should read that again because I get into my own world here. Most critically of all, this has been a test to see whether the Constitution and our commitment to the principles enshrined in the Bill of Rights could survive a national crisis and true state of emergency. We have failed the test abysmally. And I think that really sums it up perfectly, because keeping the government in line with the rules for the government isn't up to the government to tell us whether it is in line with its own rules. Relying on government to actually magically limit itself only guarantees that government will always grow no matter who's in power. And I did an episode on that just at the beginning of the year, January 8th, 2022. Who is supposed to keep the feds in check? And it says, who is responsible? And this is from the overview. Who is responsible for keeping the federal government within the limits of the Constitution? It's definitely not somehow magically getting the feds to limit their own power. And that's basically what people are doing when they're saying, vote the bums out, march on Washington, D.C., sue in federal court. In all these situations, if you're suing in federal court, you're really begging federal judges to limit federal power. If you're marching on Washington, D.C., you may think you're demanding, you're telling your employees what to do, but really what you're doing is you're begging the federal politicians to limit their own power. And if you're voting the bums out, what you're doing is you're begging the new bums to come in, if you could actually make that happen. It's not very common. If you can get new bums in, you're begging them to look at all that power that's just left for them and begging them to not use it in ways that fits their own political goals, thus encouraging the other side to do the same when they're in office. A free people claim their rights. That's how Thomas Jefferson put it, as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift of the chief magistrate. In this episode, I cover views from Jefferson, John Dickinson, George Mason, Thomas Paine, Mercy Otis Warren, and the great Lysander Spooner. It is up to the people to keep their own government within the limits of their own constitution, rather than relying on the government to somehow limit itself. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope it was kind of a fun ride to kind of listen to, look back and forth at this fable of sorts, this kind of mythical fable from John Whitehead, and these views and warnings from the founders. I'll look over in the live chat here in just a moment, but I should mention that while you're here, if you support the work we're doing, please consider supporting us, joining us as a member today. It starts out as just $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. You can also help us out by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, smashing the like button on the mainstream video platforms like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and elsewhere, subscribing, getting notifications, leaving comments, basically triggering the algorithm of those big platforms and telling them to show the program to more people. It actually does help, and we're reaching a lot more people than I ever expected. Let me take a look over on the live chat here. Alana Marie says, love the shirt. Yeah, it's a great quote. And I should, as I mentioned earlier, I should make a version where we cross out the word most. Fear is the foundation of governments. Blue North Wind says, a great episode. Thank you, Michael. Have a great day. Appreciate you being here. Clay Kent, awesome as usual. I'm not just going to read all the thank yous, but I really, really appreciate that. Sharon Patriot, when will we, the people, end the Federal Reserve? Yes. I like the idea of pushing for an audit. I don't ever expect the federal government to audit the Federal Reserve. Maybe if they thought it was popular enough. It does expose how they're unwilling to shine a light on what they're doing. But people need to start using monetary systems that are not the fiat funny money that the federal government does. Barter, crypto, gold, silver, and the like. Of course, gold backs from the United Precious Metals Association, Alpine Money Metals Exchange, I think is what it's called. So look up gold backs on the internet. You'll see how people are actually making for the barter economy. They look like bills, but they're made with real gold. It's pretty amazing. Sharon Patriot says, it's difficult to win a vote when one part... I'm going to correct that. When both party promises everything for free, because they're promising, of course, on one side, they're promising a lot of welfare programs, but on the other side, they're promising security programs, militarism, basing the U.S. government's military in 80, 100 countries around the world. And they don't point out how much that is actually costing us as well. And they're all offering us different versions of free protection from things that people are scared of, either on the right or the left. They're always trying to protect us from somebody. They've been protecting us for decades on the right against the dangers of a cannabis plant, which is absolutely absurd, using militarized police and RICO and all kinds of federal prosecution tactics. It's pretty bad. M. Gabriel says, someone said, fear is the path to the dark side. Yeah, that's a good one as well. Sharon Patriot is another good comment here. It's astounding how many people are ignoring their better instincts. And I think a lot of us, from cradle to grave, I went to a government-run school. I was propagandized. As I was a kid, I grew up thinking that every single problem had a government solution. I didn't know any better. I was trained, really, propagandized from the moment that I was born, probably in some ways, that every problem had a government solution. I thought that if the government was going to bail out the airlines when I was a kid, my instinctual thought was, well, why don't they just own the airlines? If they're going to pay for a baseball stadium, shouldn't they own the stadium as well? Jolene Kniffing, I apologize, Jolene, if I get your name wrong. I really appreciate you being here. She says, love the way God calls in the scriptures Satan the monster, the father of all lies. Our government representatives are liars and robbers. They're certainly ripping us off at every single turn possible. I appreciate you pointing that out. Thank you. Clay Kent, slowly boiling a frog, just saying. John was absolutely right with that. It's a good analogy for what we've experienced for decade after decade after decade. Totalitarian TV should know a little about totalitarianism, and they write, it's always built on fear. You wouldn't have this kind of thing if you think about every single regulation, every single mandate, every single thing that they do to somehow protect us. It's because someone's afraid of a bad result. They're afraid that other people might say things, do things, consume things, own things that they're afraid of. And so, therefore, they need government to come in with the force of a gun and stop people from doing, saying, thinking, whatever it may be, things that they're afraid of. And that's a very, very good point. And I just was really struck by this article. We ran it a couple of weeks ago, I think. About 2 weeks ago, originally, the article by John over at Rutherford Institute. And I just reread it a couple of days ago, and I'm like, man, this really, really makes a lot of sense for what we're experiencing. And I do so much work in reading original source documents from the founders that as I was reading through his article, I was like, oh, there's another one from Madison. That's another one from Paine. And I just kept seeing this all come together. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I really appreciate you being here. Jolene, Sharon, Alan Mosley, Angel Eyes over Texas, Blue North, all of you, thank you so much for your feedback in the live chat. I will continue reading through these a little bit later today. I appreciate all of it, and the comments do help us get the word out to more people, because every time you're commenting and sharing your thoughts, not only does it trigger that algorithm, but a lot of times I get ideas for future episodes as well. So I appreciate that. You can also email me over at team@10thamendmentcenter.com if you've got suggestions or comments or feedback or ideas for future episodes and the like. Again, I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you on Friday here on the Path to Liberty.